Hi everyone, and welcome to another video in my Composing Harmonies series. In the last few videos in this series, I've looked at diatonic progressions, borrowed chords, and then diatonic seventh chords, and I've demonstrated how one might harmonize simple melodies using a combination of those chords. Thanks to all of you who have submitted melodies for this series, and I've got another one to work with today. As this series is cumulative in structure, it's important that you have a good understanding of how to use diatonic major and minor triads, borrowed triads from the parallel minor or major scale, and diatonic seventh chords before watching this video. You'll also want to have a good understanding of tendencies of diatonic chords, including the relationship between dominant and tonic harmonies. With all of that said, I'll be looking at a few topics today, but the main topic is secondary dominance. Let's say that we're in the key of G major. The relationship between the tonic triad, in this case G major, and the dominant triad, in this case D major, forms the basis of functional tonal harmony. As I've said in previous videos, there's such a strong pull going from dominant to tonic, and if in your tonal chord progression you find yourself on the dominant harmony, like in this example here, there's an expectation that this measure here will lead us back to the tonic G major chord, perhaps like this. Of course, you can always subvert expectations, and often in the classical era, composers might go to the minor sixth chord here instead. That's known as a deceptive cadence. More on deceptive cadences later in this video, but really that deception works so well because it plays off of that expectation of the dominant to tonic relationship. So we know that 5-1 has such a strong harmonic pull, and we know from the circle of fifths progression that you can move around the diatonic collection using root motion by fifth. I've made these chords diatonic seventh chords. I showed a very similar progression in my last video, in fact. But only one of these harmonies right here is a dominant chord moving to tonic. What would happen to this progression if instead of diatonic seventh chords, we used all dominant sevenths? In my video on borrowed chords, we went slightly outside of the diatonic collection to find some interesting chord options, and we'll have to do the same here. Let's do just that. We'll change each of these to dominant sevenths, and I want to actually start from the end and work our way back. In the key of G major, the D7 chord is our dominant seventh chord. I suppose we could call this the primary dominant chord in this major key. No need to venture outside of the diatonic collection just yet. Okay, let's move a step backwards now. We're looking for the dominant chord that leads us to this D chord. You can sort of consider this D chord as a momentary tonic, and so the dominant chord to that temporary tonic would be an A chord. In this case, an A7 chord, because I'm adding the sevenths. Anytime you borrow a dominant chord from some temporary tonic like this, we refer to it as a secondary dominant chord. And the traditional Roman numeral chord label uses these slashes to indicate the secondary harmonic relationship. The numeral to the right of the slash indicates the chord from the diatonic collection, in this case from the G major diatonic collection. Moving another step backwards, this E7 chord is the dominant to the A chord that comes right after. As I have it here, the E7 leads into an A7 chord, but for the Roman numeral label, you actually want to label this chord as if it were going to the diatonic version of an A chord, which, because we're in the key of G major, the diatonic A chord would be a minor chord. So you label this E7 as a 5-7 of minor 2. This sort of chord labeling is all very academic and meant to show functional harmonic progression in the context of a tonal key area. For the majority of you, simply using this type of label will suffice. So I could continue moving backwards here all the way back to a G7 chord, which is the tonic G chord plus a dominant seventh, which means it's temporarily tonicizing a C chord. So you'll call this G7 chord a 5-7 of 4. By the way, for this video, I chose not to make this chord a dominant chord because a C7 chord would be the dominant to an F natural chord, and F natural isn't a part of the G major diatonic collection. Therefore, it's a bit outside the scope of this video. But the rest of these chords are all standard secondary dominant chords, And you can find them throughout classical music and many, many other genres of music as well. So let's return to this melody from before in G major. As it is here, I'm only using diatonic triads and seventh chords. If I wanted to, there's a really great opportunity to add a secondary dominant chord in the middle of this example. Anytime you see this minor 2 chord going to 5 like this, you could consider trying a secondary dominant 5 of 5 instead. I'll just change this A minor first inversion chord to an A7 first inversion chord, and then adjust the melody to include a C sharp instead of a C natural. Another option would be to bring back the A minor chord at the start of the measure, but allow that to move to a 5 of 5 mid measure, perhaps in beat 3. This is really common in classical music. Secondary dominants work just as well in minor keys. Let me make a few changes to this melody. Now we're in G minor. The diatonic 2 chord in G minor would be an A diminished. So here's what that sounds like. Instead of A diminished, I'll use the 5 of 5 again, so another A major chord, specifically an A7 chord in first inversion. So I've shown the most common classical era secondary dominant, the 5 of 5, but any of those secondary dominants from that circle of fifths progression here can add interesting harmonic colors to your music. I'll finish up this video by taking a look at another melody that one of you sent to me. Here's how this one sounds without accompaniment. So the tricky thing about this one, for me at least, is that I wasn't sure exactly what key I should use. The key signature would suggest either G major or maybe E minor, but this opening gesture suggests more of a B minor key area. So maybe you could go with that key signature and a B Phrygian collection. So there's a bunch of potential options, but no matter how you start, you have to worry about this G sharp here. This is a note outside of the diatonic collection, so perhaps a borrowed chord or a secondary dominant chord would work. Obviously, melodies sometimes modulate to a new key, but I'll see if I can make it work with just the chords I've discussed so far in this series. Because of my uncertainty with what key to start with, I wanted to look for something in this melody to really latch onto, and I think I found it with this passage right here. This looks like a melodic sequence, so I should be able to easily add a harmonic sequence to this. And now that basically any dominant seventh chord is an option, whether it's a diatonic one or a secondary one, I'll just go ahead and harmonize with seventh chords here, some dominant and some diatonic. So once I sorted that bit out, I realized that this melody could easily work in G major. This A minor 7 chord is the minor 2-7 chord in G major. The D7 is the 5 chord. Then we have the 1 chord with a major 7th added for some harmonic color. Then the 4 chord, also with an added major 7th. Then to continue the falling fifths sequence, I go to the 7/2 diminished 7 chord. This B7 chord is actually a secondary dominant chord because normally the B chord in a G major key would be a B minor chord. So we should think of this B7 chord as the dominant of an E chord. And E is the 6th scale degree in G major, so this B7 is a 5/7 of 6. So one might expect this to resolve to that E minor chord, except for the fact that we have a G sharp in the next measure. So that sounds like E major instead of E minor. Well, this is maybe another spot for a secondary dominant. I can use 5/7 of 2, which is an E7 chord, And I'm essentially continuing this falling fifths sequence further than I originally anticipated. And now that I'm invested in G major as the home key, I might as well cadence back to G, leading into measure 9. Here's what this sounds like now from measures 5 through 9. Okay, so there's a bit of repetition in this melody, so the easiest thing to do would be to repeat the chords exactly. And I might as well add the G major 7 chord in measure 1. So now it's really just these middle parts of each phrase that I need to figure out. I noticed the C to G interval here. That seems like either a C chord or maybe an A minor 7 chord, but I'll go with C major. The reason I'm going with this first inversion chord of C major is because I think another one of these B7 chords could work well as a passing chord in beat 3 of measure 1. If I have the bass note of the B7 chord be an F sharp, so that's now a 5 of 6 in second inversion, then I'm creating this really nice descending bass line, starting with G, then to F sharp, then to E in measure 2. You might be thinking, well, shouldn't the 5 of 6 go to a 6 chord? Well, that's what would be expected, but remember when I talked about deceptive cadences, I think I have to do that here because there's a C in the melody, and that C doesn't fit the E chord, but it does fit a C major chord. So I've established a harmonic pace so far with chord changes every 2 beats, and I've also established this descending bass line down from G. I'll continue that in beat 3 of measure 2, going to an E flat in the bass. I could use some sort of A diminished chord, or I could use a borrowed C minor chord in first inversion. Then I'll continue descending in the bass by step to a D in the bass in measure 3, and it seems that a D7 chord will work nicely there. Then I'll continue the bass motion going to a C in the bass, and I'll just make this a D7 third inversion chord. This leads us to measure 4. There's a B in the melody, and if I were to continue the descending bass line from the previous measure, I could have a B in the bass. I'm thinking here's another great opportunity for a B7 chord leading to an E7 chord, then an A7 chord, a string of 3 secondary dominant chords in a row using that circle of fifths sequence yet again. The A7 chord then actually could lead us into the A minor 7 chord quite nicely because they share 3 common tones. All right, let's hear how this sounds all the way to measure 9. So I think that's sounding pretty good. I'll just repeat for the most part what I've done before for measures 9 through the end of 12. Maybe just a few subtle changes, some changes in how I invert the chords. Instead of descending in the bass by step, I chose to ascend for a bit in the bass as a nice contrast. I've also chosen the A half diminished 7 chord in measure 10 instead of the borrowed C minor chord. Again, either could work nicely. Just looking for some subtle changes so that when the melody itself repeats exactly, there's a bit of the harmony that's different, but not too different. All right, I'll play this once through in its entirety. I'll get rid of the Roman numerals to make this easier to read, so I'm just showing the chord symbols. So I think this progression does a decent job of capturing the playfulness from the tempo marking. There are of course a bunch of ways I could have taken this harmonically, and I'm sure the composer of this melody probably had something very different in mind, but that's okay. I hope this video has been helpful in understanding secondary dominance, and I know that I'll be discussing this topic in future videos as well, because there's a lot to digest here. Thanks so much for watching this one, and I'll see you next time.